So welcome again. I'm John, and it's a pure delight to have you with us. I'm always humbled that you make time for this teaching. And again, this is a new teaching that we're calling Traveling Tuesdays. Nothing original there, but I sort of like the sound of it. And with all my canceled trips, I think we'll be going probably into November now. I know I've scheduled some teaching all the way through the first week. And just today, unfortunately, we received notice that we'll have to postpone our November trip. So that's like 6 so far for me this year. And, and that's sort of disappointing, but hopefully we'll be turning a corner here shortly. But welcome to our teaching today. And we're going to stay in Israel today, or tonight, I should say. And we're going to, I think, I've counted about 8 sites or so. We'll spend a little time on all of them. And again, we're featuring some of the aerial drone pictures that I took over the last couple of years, I guess. But it's always a good perspective, I think, from looking at a site, not just on the ground, and we'll do some of that, but from the air. And I think that's maybe what will make this unique as we sort of enjoy the aerial pictures. Of course, we have now available our drone video, and most of you know about that. I'm not here to advertise that, but that's a resource that we're just promoting now over the last couple weeks. It's about an hour and 6 minutes long. So from that drone video, I captured still pictures, and that's what we're going to see tonight. So let me share my screen, and then we'll get started with Israel. And by the way, tonight is Israel, and also the following week, next week, will be Israel as well. And then we're going to do, by the way, Jordan. We're going to do a night there. We're going to do a night or two in Egypt, and then at least 2 nights in Greece. A lot of biblical sites there, and Turkey. So that'll take us probably up through the beginning of November, and then we'll conclude the rest of November, or at least up to Thanksgiving, maybe a couple more weeks, most likely, with some of the other Israel sites that we did not include yet. So we're sort of going in alphabetical order, but what I want to start with tonight, and one thing I failed to do is make my mouse a little larger, but I think you can still see it. But anyway, what we are going to do tonight as we start is I forgot to show you some of these archaeological pictures. And I like, actually, let me just go back to, in fact, let me just start with that one, because it's a good perspective of Caesarea. In fact, let's fast forward to this one. This is what it looks like today. We ended with Caesarea, if you recall, last week. So the theater's over here, the palace where Paul was for a couple of years, also the fancy palace with a swimming pool over here. The hippodrome is right here, and the harbor here. But take this picture, and this is what it looked like. So Herod the Great, who built this city beginning in 22 BC, it took him 12 years. This is quite a city. It was most likely a walled city. Of course, the theater and the palace and the hippodrome and the harbor, things that we can see actually with that picture. But when we turn it around, again, before we start with the next site tonight with Caesarea Philippi, actually up north, this is quite an illustration, I think. Look how massive this harbor actually was. And as I mentioned last week, the Apostle Paul sailed in to this harbor after his third missionary journey, and then, of course, on his way to Rome. There's the big temple of Augustus, by the way. It stood 10 stories high, based on the calculations of how big the base of this was. So archaeologists sort of think that it was that high, but it would have been a massive, very impressive building. So just a couple pictures that I sort of forgot about last week, and let's now start with heading north. Now, I know last week I also had a map that I showed you, but what I did in this session, and we'll see if it really works well, instead of showing you the map through the camera, I think I put a picture of a map, and now you can see where Caesarea Philippi is. I'm making a circle with my mouse there, and it's in that general area on the north end of what we call the Hola Valley. That's the Sea of Galilee, of course, the Mediterranean to the west, the hills of Naphtali, and Mount Hermon, and right in the middle, at the end of this valley, is Caesarea Philippi. So this is what it looks like. Caesarea Philippi was a huge city, a very pagan city. Caesarea Philippi, named after one of the three sons of Herod the Great. So if we were to dig in any of this area underneath the modern road, anywhere, we would find ruins. Pretty much we only go to the grotto area, looking straight down to one of the springs called the Banias Springs. It's one of the three tributaries of the Jordan River. But here in the grotto area, this is what we want to focus on. Now, when we talk about Jesus coming into the region of the city, there's no way Jesus would have gone into such a pagan temple. And we're going to, of course, see how pagan it was in just a moment. But this is the area of the grotto. Now, a good model of what the city looked like, at least on this side of the road, the modern road. All this is conjectured, of course, but here at the base of this cliff, we see the Grotto of Pan, the Temple of Augustus, later on, Temple of Zeus, and Nemesis, but they were in late Roman times, well past the time of Jesus. So if you've ever been to Israel, of course, you've been to Caesarea Philippi, and you can see what's left of the Temple of Augustus and some of these niches, right? One's there and one's there. And of course, the god Pan was honored here. So another model might give us a good impression of how pagan this city was. And what I'm building towards is how, in contrast, how pagan this city was in contrast to what Jesus would ask his disciples in the region of this city. I think the juxtaposition, if you will, of pure paganism and one of the most transforming questions that Jesus would ask, sort of like the final exam question of his disciples, I think to see that contrast is quite amazing. So in the Roman world, of course, the belief was up from the water spring or from the underworld. The gods, of course, would come to life every spring. And that's what happened here with Pan. Archaeologically, some bronze coins have been found. I'm sometimes asked about coinage in the New Testament period. Well, I'm showing you this one because here we have a picture of Herod Philip, or Philippus, one of the sons of Herod. You can see his nose there and his eye socket. But also this one is more important because it shows us how large this Temple of Augustus was built. Had 4 columns, so what's left, of course, is a big hole. There's nothing there. There's some foundational stones down below, but we know that the temple was quite large. And of course, as I mentioned, the god Pan was sort of the shepherd god, although he was always involved with some promiscuity as well, sexual perversion, if you will. And of course, he was honored here. In fact, the name Banias comes from Pan, the Grotto of Pan. Arabs can't pronounce P, so it ends up in our Arabic terminology, Banias, instead of Panias. So notice how pagan this place was. And yet it's Jesus who came to the region. Now that word's important because, again, Jesus would not have gone into Gentile cities. I hear sometimes groups who pass by our group and they say this, and that's unfortunately incorrect. But Listen to what Jesus would ask. And of course, you've heard this perhaps before. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say the Son of Man is?" That's a term, by the way, borrowed from the book of Daniel. And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." But then Jesus gets specific. "Who do you say I am?" And it's Simon who, of course, answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." So Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh or blood, but by my Father in heaven." In verse 18, "I will tell you that you are Peter." Peter, Petros, you hear the word, the play on words on this area of the grotto where Petra, rock, is exposed. Uh, I will tell you that you, Peter, and on this rock, not the rock of this pagan grotto or temple complex, but on the life and the leadership of Peter and the other apostles, according to Paul, on this rock I will build my church. And now the gates of Hades will not overcome it. That's a very important phrase as well. Again, some scholars think that this is a reference to the gates of Hades, the underworld, the gods coming to life. But I think this was actually a Hebrew idiom, sort of a code language among rabbinical sources, because the term gates of Hades was sort of this indirect but implied definition of Gentile cities. Now, think about that, because I think what Jesus was saying here was not just a reference to maybe how pagan this city was, but specifically, he's saying, when you build your life upon me, the rock, and when you go and share the kingdom message of the gospel, not only will Jews hear and receive the message, but even people within Gentile cities. In other words, not even the gates of Gentile cities will be able to withstand the forward penetration of the message of the kingdom. I think that's the key lesson here to observe. And of course, this is exactly what happened with Peter in Acts 10, when the sheet comes down from heaven in Jaffa, and he goes to Caesarea that we just started with this morning, or this evening, I should say. And there, Peter sees the gospel and the kingdom message penetrate into the life of Cornelius and his household. So here, just within a short time, Peter, I think, really understood exactly what Jesus was saying. And I think this is what gave confidence for Peter in taking the message to Gentile cities. So the gates of Hades is mentioned here, and Jesus uses, for, in a good sense, I should say, the pure paganism of the city, and sort of turned that upside down and shared this kingdom message and how it will advance even to Gentiles in the immediate future. So Caesarea Philippi, our first site tonight. In alphabetical order, let's continue with Capernaum. Now, Capernaum is down here off the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. If you're familiar with the Sea of Galilee, it's a freshwater lake. It's about 13 miles in length. We're only seeing the north part of it, of course, but other biblical cities are located around here. Capernaum, Chorazin is up in the hill, Bethsaida is here on the north end of the lake. So this is where we're at, looking at the map, the northwest corner of the lake. So an aerial picture of the synagogue, and again, this excavation could be larger, but of course it's much smaller because of the limitation of the ability to actually excavate. So take a look at all the basaltic stone here. This is primarily, there are exceptions, primarily first century. This white synagogue is 5th century. Some say late 4th, early 5th. So this is a synagogue, most likely built on the foundation of a first century synagogue. Now, when we read about Jesus being here, Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 9, Luke 8, probably 9, and Mark 9, John 7, we have Jesus doing all kinds of things here. He's teaching in the synagogue. He's healing Peter's mother-in-law. He's healing a paralytic. Here's another angle of the synagogue, by the way. And of course, he's calling his disciples early on from most likely the shoreline of the city. Capernaum was one of 15 harbors as identified by archaeologists. So this is the 5th century synagogue on top of most likely the 1st century synagogue. Now, looking back decades, I think this picture is actually from the turn of the 20th century, early sometime in the 1900s. This is what the synagogue looked like. This was all that was there, ruins and in no form or fashion here. It was just an entire ruin. But the Catholic archaeologist who actually made this diagram, and I'm showing you this not to be technical tonight, but you can see the definitions of the 5th century synagogue and how large it was. But the red indicates most likely 1st century. So we're not sure if the synagogue was as large as the 5th century one is. Most likely not. But some will say it was much smaller based on the very limited 1st century ruins that you can see highlighted in red. This comes from the diagram of the Catholic archaeologist who dug here, when was it, 50s and 60s, I believe. But they did a great job. And of course, this is important to us, knowing that there was a synagogue here. Most likely this town looked like this. This is the main synagogue. And again, prior to the temple being destroyed in 70 AD, synagogues were not worship centers. They were study places. They were places to gather to read scripture. They were communal places. And of course, Capernaum being on the shoreline, that meant we have disciples like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and even Matthew or Levi, the tax collector. He was a port tax collector, by the way, who probably stood somewhere on the shoreline of this lake. So we have at least 5 disciples of the 12 initial ones who identified well with Capernaum. By the way, this model shows well the Arbel Cliff that we saw last week. Here's the shoreline, and again, Arbel. Don't you want to climb it? You guys who've climbed it with us, it's a great view from on top. But again, Matthew chapter 4 tells us that Jesus calls the disciples, and these fishermen, no doubt, were out here on the shoreline, and Jesus calls them to be Talmidim. That's a Hebrew word for disciples. Here's the text from Matthew 4. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, we can picture it here. He saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and they were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. Our third site, Tel Dan. And we'll return to this picture in just a moment. Tel Dan is way back up to the north border with Israel and Lebanon and Syria over here, by the way. Tel Dan is just to the west of Caesarea Philippi. It's about right there, right on the border. So what was found at Tel Dan? Well, a couple of things that are very, very impressive. First of all, they found an altar and a high place. Now, when we talk about Judges 18, for instance, and eventually 1 Kings chapter 12, we know that this place, even from the time of the Danites relocating here, I won't go into that story, but you can read it about it in Judges 18. A high place was set here. And then that whole attitude of bringing sort of a cultic presence to this site. It continued, of course, with Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam, if you recall, was the first divided kingdom, king of the north of Israel. And Jeroboam set up a high place in Dan and in Bethel. Bethel is just north of Jerusalem. Dan is this far north, right on the border. In fact, that, if you can see just through that tree there, maybe another picture will show it better. That's Lebanon. That's how close we are to the border. But only the foundation and I think an incense shovel was found here, but based on the size of the base of this altar, they conjecture that this was a large altar. And then, of course, you would have walked up these steps, and a high place was set here. Now, what's interesting is that some of these stones are 9th century, 10th century, I should say, but some of them are 9th and even early 8th century, I believe, which tells us that this high place, even after Jeroboam I passed away, after establishing cultic worship here, even his predecessors, those successors, I should say, those who followed him, they would also use the same temple complex. So we have this temple complex complete with a high place that was apparently built and rebuilt again. That tells us of the continual level of disobedience practiced here at this site. What did it look like? Perhaps like this. Again, the altar area and the steps leading up to the high place. Today, this is Mount Hermon. Lebanon owns this this part of the mountain. And let's see, I guess we don't have another picture showing the Lebanon border in this presentation, but that's okay. We're here to talk about the biblical connections. And of course, this may be one of them as well. Coming from that high place area, we walk another half a mile or so. And as we leave the site, we come across this mud brick gate. It dates to the 18th century BC. Some will say 17th century BC, but you can see that it's mud brick. It's simply filled because we dare not take any of this debris out because most likely the mud brick would collapse. There's a very similar gate that dates to about 100 years older, actually in Ashkelon, that they have well preserved now, even just this summer. But some will call this Abraham's Gate. Now, I don't want to sort of throw water on the fire because when you go to this site, there's a big display here, and it's called Abraham's Gate, and Genesis 14:14 talks about Abraham being here, and people like to say, well, Abraham most likely walked through this gate when it was called Laish, Laish. That's how you pronounce the city, the former name of the city. But I think personally, chronologically, if this is even 18th century BC, it's still too late for it to be a gate that Abraham used. Abraham is more or less 2000 BC, and this gate is about 250 years later or after the time of Abraham. So I don't know. I guess I want to be accurate in how I interpret archaeology and blend that with the Bible, but I would say that this gate does not date to the time of Abraham, but nonetheless, it's an impressive mud brick gate of the Canaanites. Now, there is an Iron Age gate complex. There's the outer gate and another inner gate here. Some of this has been reconstructed for us, but these walls date to the 9th century BC, from the time after Jeroboam. And maybe they look like this. You would have walked in an outer gate into an area where the judge would have sat to make rulings or decisions. And then there was another inner gate. So this city was well fortified. The city, by the way, collapsed in 722 BC when the Assyrians came. Tiglath-Pileser, if you remember that name from the Bible, in 734 BC, came in the first wave of the Assyrians, and then later Sargon II, and the whole northern kingdom is destroyed, I think, because of disobedience. But can you picture living in a city like this, fortified with such a gate? Now, one thing before we leave Dan and go to our next site is this inscription that was found in 1991 or 92. And you can see that this highlighted part in white is the name in Aramaic, a 9th century text. It mentions the name of David, the house of David. What is this? This is the famous Dan inscription. And it was written by Hazael, the sort of the arch enemy of Israel, the Aramean king, Hazael. And he is basically saying and bragging that he defeated the house of David. Why this is so important is because it's the only reference to David outside the Bible. So this primary source of the name David is very, very important. It's displayed at the Israel Museum. Now, I'm showing you this picture because in 2017, at a site where I dug in 2014, at Abel Beit Ma'akah, right on the Lebanon border, this head, and I'm showing you this from a distance. This is, again, displayed in the Israel Museum. It's about 2.5 inches high, but here, let me zoom in on this and look at the detail of this head. Now, the question is, whose head is it? It dates to the 9th century in a site that was an Aramean city, at least at some point in history. It was also an Israelite city. 2 Samuel 20 tells us that in the time of David. But it also was an Aramean city. So could this be King Ben-Hadad? Could this be Hazael, the same guy who wrote this? Or could this be Ahab? Of course, we'll never know, but these are the 3 leading choices, I think. And that's quite interesting. But it connects us to people who are mentioned in the Bible. Wouldn't you just love finding something like this? So, did this guy write this? That's the million-dollar question. Let's go to Gedi. There is some archaeology here, a Chalcolithic temple. That means a temple that dates to about 4000 BC. It's on a high hill near this gorge or canyon called the Wadi David. But we're not going to pay attention to that. There's also a Talmudic temple, by the way, or a synagogue, I should say, and a village that dates to about the 5th or 6th century AD. But why we are going here today in this part of the desert, in fact, Gedi is right there. So on the west shoreline of the Dead Sea. Masada is just south, about 15-minute drive, and Qumran, if you recall, is up here on the northwest corner of the sea. So this Gedi place is an oasis. It's mentioned a couple places. We walk, of course, into this canyon, and we observe the water that still flows here. This is an oasis. And water, believe it or not, on a 110-degree day in June or July, water is still flowing. In fact, you just barely see a waterfall there at the top of the picture. But a beautiful place. As for deserts, water flows, therefore we have green, reeds, and yet it's a barren place. Of course, we connect with David and Saul in 1 Samuel 24. David was here. He hid in a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. And of course, if you know that narrative, David could have killed Saul at that moment, but because he was God's anointed, he chose not to do that. But why in the world was David here in the first place? Remember, there's about 6 or so chapters that are committed, or they focus upon Saul basically chasing down David. So David is here in the desert primarily because there's water. And this is the one of the waterfalls, the highest of the waterfalls, a beautiful place to get wet if you want. But there's also a nice reference to the Song of Songs in the Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 14, that talks about the henna blossoms from the vineyards of Gedi. So that's quite romantic, if you will. So here Solomon writes these words in celebration to the beauty of love and commitment. The cluster of henna blossoms from the vineyards of Gedi. Now we continue alphabetically again to a site called El Araj. Now this is most likely biblical Bethsaida. Bethsaida is where Peter, Andrew, and Philip grew up, according to John 1. So we're looking at the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, which means this side is the east side. And the Jordan River flows from the north into the lake. So we're right here at the very north end of the Sea of Galilee. And these are the ruins based on 3 or maybe 4 years now of excavation. This is just a small section of the excavation. This past year, not this summer, because really hardly any excavation took place because of COVID, but about 100 yards away, there's another area that they opened up. But you can see, first of all, some of the structures on top there, primarily from the late Roman period. So 5th, 6th, 7th century AD. Of course, we're not too interested in that because it doesn't relate to the Bible. But there are lower levels of this site that do date to the 1st century. So those who are excavating here, Steve Notley from Nyack College is one of them, doing a great job here in exposing the possibility that this was biblical Bethsaida. So we go here. It's an off the beaten track site. And this year, I guess, all of this was underwater. In fact, I don't think I put a picture of that in. No, I didn't, I guess. I was thinking about it. But all of this, if you could picture it, with the water level so high of the lake, all of the ruins were underwater, submerged underwater. So I don't know if they could have dug anyway, unless, of course, it was later on this summer. But they usually dig here, I think, in late May and June. But when we were here a couple of years ago, a guy named Bill from Idaho. In fact, I might be seeing Bill from Idaho this weekend, as I have the opportunity to teach in Idaho Falls this weekend. But he found, when I was teaching, he found, and just a portion of this was exposed, but he was looking for old pottery and so forth. But he found this 1,200-pound basaltic lioness, and he, of course, cleaned it off the best he could, and it's quite amazing of what he found. Now, it was in a pile that was filled with debris and rebarb and old Turkish building debris, and it was just out of place. Like, how in the world could this be something of antiquity? Because it's in a debris pile that was not necessarily old, if you will, quote unquote. So here's Bill trying to move this thing after we get done talking about Bethsaida. You know, there's a story in Mark 8 about the blind man from being here. And of course, the feeding of the 5,000 most likely took place here in the vicinity of Bethsaida, according to the Gospels. But of course, it's too heavy to move, so we just leave it like this. And Bill wants to take it home with us, with him, but of course that's not possible, nor is that even proper. So we leave it there. So about a month later, I read in an Israeli archaeological paper online that archaeologists found 6th century basaltic lioness. So here's the crane taking it out from this debris pile that was filled with all kinds of modern stuff. So apparently it was old. It dated to the late Roman period, to the 6th century AD. And it really forced the archaeologists to go through this debris pile the following year. And guess what? They found another piece from the 6th century. So now I'm telling you this story not just for the sake of the adventure and Bill from Idaho found it, but I get a kick every time I read the headlines. Like in Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, perfect lioness carving from 1,500 years ago discovered in a pile of dirt in Israel. So it made the headlines, of course. How about this one? Lioness relief discovered in the Galilee. Like dramatic headlines. But what really cracks me up is this one. A basaltic lioness roars again. So now it's I don't even know if it's on display anywhere, but of course it's in the possession of the archaeologists. But here, this line is, it just, you can read it. It's just beyond me. Archaeologists have uncovered the relief of a lioness chiseled out of a basaltic rock and weighing 1,300 pounds near to Tel Araj. Well, I'm sorry, archaeologists did not discover it, or did they uncover it? Take note, my friends, it was Bill from Idaho who uncovered it. So I guess what happened is they wanted to take the credit. And of course, that's sort of how the news works. You've heard of fake news before, right? Well, unfortunately, it works in the archaeological circles as well. Let's go to Gamla. Gamla. In fact, you can see just barely the northern tip and El Araj where we were just at. It's right here. Can you see it? That's the northern edge of the lake. So 6 miles due east up this canyon is this site of of Gamla. That's where El Araj is. And now we're 6 miles due east. So Gamla is about right here. And what was Gamla? It was a Jewish site from the 1st century BC until it was destroyed in 66 AD by the Romans. This was the first site or city conquered by the Romans in what we call the First Revolt. So our focus will be here in this structure, although there are walls to this city. Josephus, the Jewish historian, was here, by the way. He would actually run from this site back to the lower Galilee. You can see the big fortified tower of this city. And the Romans, of course, controlled it. They surrounded it because it's built like a camel. Part of the city is really built on a cliff, so that part did not need to be fortified. But the Romans, of course, hurled big basaltic stones here and over to the city, and of course eventually destroyed it and conquered it completely. Josephus says 4,000 or so people died here. But this structure is what is of interest to us. Now, sometimes we actually can bust down and sit into the synagogue. That's what it is. It's one of 7 first-century synagogues. And what's so neat about it is that even though it's not mentioned in the Gospels, I would like to think that since it was a first-century synagogue, and that Matthew 4 and later on Matthew 9, I think it's verses 35 or 36, it says that Jesus spoke in many of the Galilean synagogues. So was it one like this? It was rectangular, very modest. Maybe 100 people could fit in this one. You would have entered from this left side. So did Jesus walk this way? And did he stand right here as he taught about the kingdom? I'd like to think he did. Others think he did not venture over to this eastern part of the area, but it's a first century synagogue, a Jewish site, certainly, and we can picture Jesus teaching here. There is that passage in Matthew chapter 9 that I alluded to. And he went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. Now let's go back to the central part of the country, actually to the Shvela, to the city of Gath. In fact, I'm looking for a map here, so I forgot to place it in here. So let me show you where Gath is. Gath is right there. So you can see the higher yellow elevation that's here. This is the hill country of Judah. The Shvela is the lowlands. It served as a buffer between the hill country and the coastal plain here along the Mediterranean. So Gath was a Philistine city. We know that from a couple references in the Old Testament. It's a huge city. I actually had a chance to dig here in 2018, I guess it was. It's a 130-acre site. This is one of the views from on top. In fact, there's a good depiction of Goliath, who was from Gath. So we're looking actually in looks like the south. Let's see here. I think we're looking north from this perspective. And yet we see a lot of excavations. This has been excavated for 22 years now, 23 maybe. So all of this is old excavation, exposed many, many things from beginning of the early Canaanite period all the way through, of course, the destruction of the city by the Arameans. In fact, the same Hazael came here and destroyed it. That's actually mentioned in the book of 2 Kings, I think chapter 12. But look at this big broad wall here. This is high on the Tel, excavated by a great team of archaeologists. Jeff Chadwick is actually digging here. He's a good friend from Mormon University, and Aaron Mayer, an Israeli. But what we did was we dug here off the slopes of the Tel, and again, area, I think it was called D. They found some impressive things here, but underneath the canopy is where we actually would enjoy breakfast here and a snack, but under this canopy is where we dug. So I had a chance to dig at the gate area, and of course we found all kinds of things as we dug down lower and lower. We found Philistine pottery that was colored like this. A couple colors is quite indicative of Philistine pottery. Bottoms of jars and the tops of water vessels. And of course, if we dig really fast like this, this is how we work. We collect the dirt in the black buckets, and we collect the pottery in the blue. Of course, we dump the dirt, and we save and eventually wash all the pottery that we find. So that's how we dig. Of course, it's sped up a little, but a fun time. In 2000, I think it was 9, don't quote me on that, Aaron Mayer, here, an Israeli archaeologist, actually found a 2-horned altar, which is quite interesting. The Philistines apparently had 2-horn altars, and the Israelites, or the Judeans, had altars with 4 horns. But I'd like to think that maybe it was at this gate, identified as the water gate, because the water source was down here. Could it be that David, who actually, after he killed Goliath, he actually found some refuge here with a guy named Achish, the king of Gath, But look what David did here by the gate. He took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath, even though he was given um, protection from Saul here. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate. There's the gate, and letting saliva run down his beard. Of course, there were other gates of the city. We can't say it was this gate, but that's quite interesting. And again, this reference to Hazael in 2 Kings 12. He actually attacked Gath and captured it. So this came to an end, this city, in about 830 BC. 830 BC. Gezer, I think, is our last site for the evening. We've been trying to keep this to 45 or 50 minutes, but this is a 30-acre site. Looking again northward, you can see the hill country of Judah. In fact, I guess I forgot to put a map again, but let me just grab it here just for a moment, because Gezer is just a little north of Gath. It's in what we call the Ajalon or the Ayalon Valley. So again, between the hill country of Judah to the east and the coastal plain to the west. So Gezer, again, a Canaanite city mentioned as being destroyed, or taken, I should say, by Joshua. And you can see this archaeological tell here. Some excavations happening here and also right below us. So here, these ruins below us date to the time of the Canaanite period. These are primarily Middle Bronze ruins or gates and structures. This is actually a tower, and a wall was attached to it, and the city gate was over here. Just down here off to the left corner was a water shaft or a water system. I don't think I included any pictures of that. I perhaps could have, but you notice that these ruins are quite massive and impressive. They date about 1600 or 1650 BC. The Middle Bronze period extends from about 2100 to about 1500. If you're taking notes. But as I dug here, a girl, 22-year-old girl digging in the square right next to me, actually found this. This is a picture, I think it's my picture, where we actually took a picture of what she found. We couldn't really tell, because here in this little piece of pottery, a bowl, this was found. So within an hour, the authorities from Jerusalem come and they whisk this item away. It was an important discovery. And they clean it up. And again, a couple of months later, they finally published it. And this ended up being a very, very important discovery of apparently some kind of piece of amulet. Piece of jewelry, symbols of Canaanite gods, similar to the Akkadian gods of Mesopotamia. Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, and Sin, the god of the moon. That was found right there. Sort of neat to be a part of a dig that found something of importance. This was, again, dating to the time probably about close to 200 years prior to Joshua coming. So this is a gate. Again, it's a chamber gate. You can see at least one chamber here on the one side and the other chamber here. Eventually, this area where you see the grass was actually excavated because the team wanted to see what was below these big, massive stones. This gate was made of stone, but also you can see the mud brick, very similar to the city of Dan up north. But here's another connection with Solomon, because this is a higher level of excavation. Steve Ortiz excavated here. You can see uh, the wall of the city and many, many ruins, including a gate that no doubt was made by King Solomon. King Solomon, according to 1 Kings 9, refortified three cities: Gezer here in the south, Hatzor in the north, and Megiddo in the central part of the country. This is also a chamber gate, 6 chambers, 3 on one side, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. This one actually had a water drainage channel underneath. Here, when we fly our drone outside the city, we're looking now into the city. So this would have been the way to enter the city of Gezer. Now, Gezer was a Canaanite city. Apparently, it remained Canaanite until the Egyptian pharaoh, could it be a guy named Amun, who actually attacked the city and gave it to Solomon's wife, who happens to be the daughter of this pharaoh. So we know that this city was then refortified by Solomon. What this gate looked like is probably similar to this. Credit to these folks here who post all kinds of great displays and I guess models or illustrations of things that are of antiquity. You can see the drainage channel underneath, and of course, a wooden gate, and the outer tower would have been perhaps a little higher, but this was a typical gate of both the Israelites and, of course, the Judeans who lived here in the south part of the country after the divided kingdom. We see these chambered gates also in places like Lachish. There was also a high place here with these standing stones, probably part of a Canaanite high place. But look at the fantastic view, looking due west now to the coastline, actually, to the southern suburbs of Tel Aviv, which is off to the right. But on a clear day, you can see the high buildings of Ashdod, and further down is Ashkelon, 2 Philistine cities. In 1909, 1907, something like this, a guy named McAllister actually found this small stone. You can see the Paleo-Hebrew text on it. Most think it's Paleo-Hebrew. Some think it's maybe a varied Canaanite type of text. I'm not sure, but it's quite impressive and very important, because what this says in English is this. It's basically a calendar for harvest. 2 months of harvest, 2 months of planting, 2 months of late planting, 1 month of hoeing, 1 month of barley harvest, 1 month of harvest and festival, 2 months of grape harvesting, 1 month of summer fruit. It was signed by a guy named Abijah. So this maybe was the scribe of this small stone. It's about the size of, I would say, a piece of paper, about 8 by 11 piece of paper. So it's not really small, but what is really, I think, impressive to connect with as we close this session is, since this dates to the time of Solomon, 10th century BC, it's interesting to open up our Bibles, and we'll conclude with this as we read from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Because Solomon, too, wrote about the seasons of life. And as you know well, I'm sure, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, a time to die, to plant, to uproot, to kill, to heal, to tear down, to build, to weep, to laugh, to mourn, to dance, to scatter stone, to gather them, to embrace, to refrain from embracing, to search and to give up, to keep, to throw away, to tear and to mend, to be silent, to speak, to love and to hate, in a time for war and a time for peace. I think it's neat to connect with the words of Solomon there as we end this session of, again, just sights from Israel. So let me end with this, just to remind you that next Tuesday, of course, as part of our Traveling Tuesdays, we'll meet again at 8:30, same time. But as I mentioned early on, in case you missed it, Zoom now is requiring that the pre-registration process includes a password. So you'll find that password on our homepage of our website, and I'll also be emailing this out if you are on our email list. So I guess that's it for now. And I really appreciate you being part of our time today. And I hope to see you again next week. Again, we'll continue most likely through most of November now with another session in Israel next week. And then we'll move to Jordan, Egypt, Greece, and Turkey, and then probably back to Israel as well. Okay, so thanks very much, and we'll see you again. And again, I'll hang out here for a moment if you have any questions about our session tonight. Take care, and thank you. God bless.